My name is Grace Whitfield. I am 28 years old, and the last time my mother addressed me in public, the word she used was a defect. She said it at my sister's wedding, inside a massive stone ballroom where over 200 guests were present, while I stood there holding a glass of champagne I had never even asked for. Why is this defect here? A heavy 9-year silence, and that was her opening line. My sister Vivian turned away from her expensive wedding photographer, looked at my face, and smiled the exact way you smile at a dirty stain on a gorgeous, expensive rented tablecloth. "You are not invited," she whispered through gritted teeth. She was absolutely right about that. She just had no idea who had actually been invited that night. My family had 9 whole years to find out what I had become or where I was, but they spent those entire 9 years pretending I was never born. What the groom did that night didn't just end the evening, it brought down a massive medical empire that had been 3 generations in the making, and I didn't have to raise my voice even once. But this story doesn't start in that ballroom. It starts 10 years ago at a country club, with a graduation gown and a mahogany-paneled wall of framed diplomas holding one empty frame. If you have ever been made to feel tiny and insignificant at your own family's dinner table, then this story is for you. Exactly 3 weeks before the wedding, a heavy cream-colored envelope arrived at our house. It was as thick as a dinner menu at an expensive restaurant. It was addressed to Dr. Daniel Whitfield and Mrs. Grace Whitfield in beautiful calligraphy that probably cost more than my first month's rent when I was 19. Invitations for Daniel usually meant big hospital galas. I sliced it open with a butter knife, my mind still preoccupied with my employees' payroll. Then I read the names printed on that thick paper. "The Holston family requests the honor of your presence at the marriage of their son, Dr. Eric Holston, to Vivian Dixon." Vivian Dixon, my own flesh and blood sister. I stood in my own kitchen and read her name 4 times, as if those black ink letters might miraculously rearrange themselves into a stranger's name. The tiles beneath my feet were freezing. The low hum of the fridge echoed in the silence. In another city, my family was planning a massive wedding, and an invitation bearing my married name had slipped right through their defenses. Daniel walked in, read the invitation over my shoulder, and very carefully set his coffee cup down on the marble counter. In a very calm voice, he said, "You don't have to go, Grace." Without looking at him, I said, "I know, but that's not the same as not wanting to." He didn't argue with me. He is a senior trauma surgeon. He knows perfectly well the difference between a deep wound that desperately needs stitches and one that just needs fresh air to heal. We sat at our kitchen table and laid out ground rules like we were holding a board meeting. We would attend the wedding, sit in the back row, congratulate the groom out of basic courtesy, and quietly slip out before the family drama could ignite. For that evening, I picked out a navy blue dress, as quiet and plain as wallpaper. I genuinely thought I would walk in like a well-mannered stranger, but I was wrong on every front, and the first crack appeared before I even finished my first glass of sparkling water. The estate was perched on a gorgeous hill of manicured vineyards, complete with stone arches and massive, bathtub-sized chandeliers. My family always knew how to set a stage and flaunt their wealth. Daniel got pulled into a circle of doctors from St. Anne's Hospital near the bar, which was fine by me. I drifted toward the terrace in my wallpaper dress, holding a champagne flute a passing waiter had handed me, counting down the minutes until the ceremony started. I just wanted it to be over quickly. That was when I heard my mother's voice for the first time in 9 years. It was coming from the other side of a large stone pillar, bright, polished, and perfectly curated, her signature hostess voice reserved exclusively for strangers. "2 families of doctors are uniting. Can you imagine the golden future of our grandchildren?" she was boasting. A woman laughed at her remark, And then my mother said the thing that knocked the wind out of me, like someone had violently slammed a door on my hand. Vivian has always been extraordinary. Our daughter, our only child. You understand? We poured our everything into her, dedicated our entire lives to her, our only child. I stood perfectly still behind that pillar, exactly how you freeze when a venomous wasp lands on your skin. I had prepared myself to be the estranged sister. I had not prepared to be completely erased. Erasure is far cleaner than hatred. It leaves no corpse, just an empty space where a living, breathing person used to stand. Somewhere in that crowd, my father was wearing a custom suit, nodding and agreeing with every word. I looked down and saw that the champagne in my glass was trembling violently, and I forced my hand to stop, because I had learned very early in childhood that in front of these people, you never tremble, you never show weakness. To understand what happened next, and why I felt that way behind the pillar, I need to show you the hallway I grew up in. In my parents' house, there is a massive wall, and on that wall hang 11 frames. My grandfather Chase's medical degree, my mother's cardiology board certification, my father's anesthesiology fellowship. A century's worth of Dixon and Chase family achievements encased in mahogany and glass. We simply called it the wall. Every Sunday at dinner, we had a bizarre family ritual. My mother would ask each of us what we had achieved that week, and our answers were graded like lab reports. Vivian always had excellent numbers ready. Class rank, test scores, science fairs. She was the blue-chip investment that always performed well for them. I was an entirely different kind of kid. I could gently bandage a wounded bird's broken wing, but I would completely freeze in academic competitions, bringing home grades that dropped onto the dining table like rotten fruit, bringing absolute silence. My mother never yelled about it. Yelling was for lower-class families with no standards. She simply withdrew her attention from me. Exactly the way you would rebalance a losing stock market portfolio. The summer I turned 14, a 12th frame was hung on that wall, right below Vivian's Honor Society certificate. It was completely empty. When I asked my mother what it was for, she gave me a dry loan officer smile and said it was mine, pending. Fast forward to 10 years ago at that country club, the week I graduated high school. My mother had booked the garden room. 22 relatives, white tablecloths, crystal glasses, and a printed menu. I wore a light yellow dress I had bought with my own money earned from my small pharmacy job. My graduation was the technical reason for the evening, but there was a second act to that night. Between the salad and the main course, my mother stood up, tapped her silver spoon against her glass, and announced that Vivian had been accepted into the top medical school in the country, her first choice, with a massive scholarship offer, the whole 9 yards. The entire room gave a standing ovation as if they had been rehearsing it for weeks. My father raised his glass and gave a toast to the new Dr. Dixon. The waiter quietly placed my dessert in front of me, while everyone else was looking at Vivian at the other end of the table. For a few minutes, I sat completely alone at my own graduation party, eating chocolate cake. I had my own little plan, a certified nursing assistant course starting in September, paid for with my own blood, sweat, and tears. I even had the brochure printed out. Then my mother tapped her glass again and said the sentence I can still hear in any quiet room to this day. And yes, she said in a voice as cold as a surgical scalpel, we should say something about Grace. Every face turned toward me. My mother looked at me the way she would examine a chest x-ray and smiled. One daughter got the sharp Dixon brain, she said, tilting her glass toward Vivian. And the other, well? She let the silence do the heavy lifting. Silence was her surgical blade, too. An ugly high school graduate is still a high school graduate. We are just celebrating what we have here today. A few people chuckled the way people laugh at a terrible joke made by their boss. Hollow, nervous laughter. I sat there perfectly straight, chocolate on my fork, with 18 years of strict training in my spine, and I gave that garden room zero drama. No tears, no running away. I finished that cake. It tasted like dry plaster. Later that night, when I asked about the empty frame, my mother walked me to the wall, touched the empty 12th frame with her manicured finger, and delivered the family motto. In this family, love is always earned. This frame is waiting for you. What you put in it is entirely up to you. I told her that the frame could wait forever, because I was not going to medical school. My mother stared at me for a long time and said, "Then it will hang empty, and every guest who comes to our house will know exactly why." She left me there and went to sleep. I stood in that hallway until I heard the porch door creak. A very sweet voice called out, "Come sit with me, my child." My grandmother Ruth was sitting on the wooden porch swing in her knitted cardigan. She was my mother's biological mother. Ruth had been a hospital nurse for 40 years. Night shifts, tending to deep wounds, the painful side of medicine that holds no glory or glamour. She unclasped her old steel watch from her wrist. That heavy nurse's watch with the sweeping second hand she had used to count thousands of heartbeats, and she lovingly strapped it onto my wrist. "I have worn this for 40 years, she said. "It has seen people through the worst, most terrifying nights of their lives, and this watch has never once asked a single patient for their class rank." "Grace," she said, "listen to me carefully. Nobody earns love, my child." She stopped there and stared into the dark yard as if the rest of the sentence lived out there in the shadows. Exactly 10 months after that porch swing conversation, that watch was the only thing I owned that my family couldn't strip away from me, because 10 months later, they kicked me out of the house. First went my college fund. My father explained that the fund had been reallocated to Vivian's medical education. "An investment goes where the returns are," my mother added. I was ready for this storm. Exactly 1 week after my high school graduation, I had opened my own bank account, finished my CNA certification at night, and started taking night shifts at a home care agency, where I cleaned elderly people's walkers and helped bathe strangers with dignity. I absolutely loved the work, which was the unforgivable sin to them. My mother could not stomach a daughter who found success in menial, helping hand labor. The ultimatum came on a Tuesday in April. "Quit the agency job, get back on the family track, or pack your bags and leave this house." I packed in 40 minutes flat. I put my clothes in 2 black trash bags, grabbed my certification folder, and had Ruth's watch on my wrist. At the front door, my mother said, "You are choosing to be nobody. You will have no identity." I fired back without blinking. "I am choosing to be someone you can never grade." And I walked out with my trash bags. 9 full years later, my mother would stand in a stone hallway and offer me that door back on one condition. But first, she had to call me a defect in front of 200 people, which brings us back to that ballroom. "Why is this defect here?" she said in a low hush. Vivian arrived a second later in a cloud of tulle and sheer panic, gripping her bridal bouquet like a weapon. "You are not invited," she whispered. I calmly said, "Congratulations on your wedding, Vivian." I meant it from the bottom of my heart, which annoyed her more than anything else I could have said. My mother sensed the shifting mood. "We will talk somewhere quiet," she announced, pointing toward a side room. Vivian turned away, and I walked into the side room. I had spent 9 years learning exactly what their theatrical games could and could not do to me. They thought they were eliminating a massive problem before the Holston family noticed. In reality, they were walking me into a ballroom that contained my husband, my life's work, and the one person who knew exactly who I was. My father was already in that side room. For 9 years, I had told myself a comforting little story about my father, that he was the quiet one, a hostage to my mother's demands, and that he probably missed me. He looked at me now, for the first time since the trash bags, and simply said, "Use the kitchen door. There is a service corridor behind the kitchen. Don't make your mother repeat herself." He didn't ask how I was. He didn't even say my name. And then it finally clicked for me. His silence was never the silence of a hostage. He had voted with my mother at every single meeting. I said, no. I already walked out the front door of this family once with all my belongings in trash bags. I will never exit through a back door ever again. My phone vibrated against my hip. It was a text from Daniel. "Eric is asking where you went. He wants to introduce you to his mother." After getting kicked out, my first client was a retired machinist named Mr. Algar. I held a man's dignity in my 2 hands for 8 hours a day, and I never let it drop once. I slept in a tiny studio apartment above a laundromat and kept a spiral notebook documenting everything my home care agency did wrong. I saved every spare dollar in a coffee tin like a Great Depression-era grandmother. And then, the fall I turned 23, my own grandmother's phone stopped ringing. Ruth had suffered a massive stroke. I found out 2 days later from her neighbor because no one in my family bothered to call me. I wasn't on the visitor list. That list was managed by my mother. I went to the hospital, but the receptionist told me my name wasn't on the list. I was a nobody on paper, and paperwork was my mother's home turf. 11 days later, Ruth passed away. A week before her stroke, she had left me a voicemail. 41 seconds long. With trembling hands, I pressed play. I made it to 12 seconds. "Gracie, it's your grandmother. Don't you dare delete this." My thumb hit stop like a reflex because her voice was so alive. I kept that voicemail safe for 5 years, and I never once let it play all the way through. 6 months after losing Ruth, I took out $12,000, rented a 2-room office, and started my own home care agency. I named it Brightwater. My hiring policy was 1 sentence long: hire the people who show up on time. 5 years later, Brightwater had 340 caregivers across 3 states, and I had a title I still couldn't say without laughing: founder and president. One Tuesday, a hospital called about a patient no one else would take. The surgeon himself got on the line and asked if Brightwater was as good as its reputation. I said, "Both." And he laughed and said, "Come prove it." He was expecting a sales rep with a folder. What walked in was a founder who had done every care plan chore with her own 2 hands. Dr. Daniel Whitfield, 32 at the time, senior trauma surgeon at the hospital. We argued for 20 minutes over discharge protocols, and I won twice. He noticed the nurse's watch and asked who it belonged to. Vending machine coffee turned into real cafe coffee, which then turned into 2 years of the most peaceful thing that had ever happened to me. He knew everything before he proposed. We got married in his mother's backyard. I happily took his name. But 2 weeks before that wedding, I sent an invitation to my parents' house. The envelope came back 13 days later. It had been opened and placed in a new envelope with my mother's handwriting. On the back of my own invitation was a single line: "Don't embarrass yourself." Daniel read it and said, "We can just be happy. That's the best revenge." 2 years ago, St. Anne's Hospital approached Brightwater with a proposal. They wanted to start a geriatric medicine fellowship and needed a founding sponsor. I had one condition. It would be called the Ruth Chase Fellowship, named after a nurse who worked 40 years of night shifts and never got a frame on anyone's wall. And my name would not appear anywhere. The first Ruth Chase Fellow was selected that spring. His name was Eric Holston. I funded a stranger's future and didn't tell a soul. And this spring, that stranger sent me an invitation to his wedding because he was marrying my sister. The ceremony itself was beautiful. I sat in the back row with Daniel. My professional brain started analyzing this wedding. The bride was a dermatologist, yet not a single guest from her side was introduced as a colleague. Whenever someone asked Vivian a direct medical question, my mother answered on her behalf. I had spent 9 years learning that when this family carefully crafts a story, someone is usually bleeding out under the gown. Then we found our table. Table number 2. Groom's side. Engraved place cards. Dr. and Mrs. Whitfield. Across the ballroom, my mother picked up the seating chart. Her finger stopped on table 2, and for a split second, Dr. Lorraine Dixon lost complete control of her face. Table 2 was sacred ground. You don't seat strangers there, and you definitely don't seat defects. She looked at Daniel, and I could see the gears turning in her head. She had no idea who Whitfield was. For 9 years, she hadn't thought about me once. Vivian was fast. I watched her walk across the room, leaning over the place cards, and she turned ghost white. My mother appeared at her elbow, and they huddled behind a floral arrangement. They had a problem. They couldn't remove me without explaining who I was. And as they were talking, a silver-haired woman in blue silk was walking toward table 2. The groom's mother. Grace Whitfield, said Dr. Susan Holston. After all, Eric talks about Brightwater like it's a teaching hospital. We talked for a minute, and then she asked the question. So Grace, how do you know our Vivian? Understand the power I was being handed. I could blow up the wedding, the merger, my mother's entire empire right then and there. I took a breath and said, we grew up in the same town. Vivian had watched the whole exchange. She grabbed me alone by the coat check and dragged me into the stone hallway. You are going to take that back right now, Vivian said. I asked her, what story did you tell them about me, Vivian? And my sister said, there is no story. You don't exist. As far as the Holston family is concerned, I am an only child. They hadn't buried me. They had never even dug the hole. You are leaving before the toasts, she continued. You'll fake a migraine. But her hands were shaking. Her eyes kept darting toward the ballroom. Toward Eric. A woman defending a lie gets annoyed, but a woman defending a lie that her whole life depends on gets terrified. Enjoy the toasts, I said, and walked back inside. I went to the coat check. I had brought one hope to this wedding, that maybe 9 years had loosened something. Now I had my answer. There was no door. Daniel stepped up beside me. He held out his hand. Just then, Ruth's watch snagged on my sleeve, and I thought about a woman who walked through the Dixon family's front door for 6 decades in a nurse's cardigan, and never once used the service entrance. I handed Daniel the ticket. We are staying for the toasts, I said. Inside, my mother gave the first toast. She talked about the merging of 2 great medical families and recited the family motto. In this family, everything is earned, our name most of all. My mother wasn't quoting herself. She was still that little girl reporting her class rank to a man with a ledger in his lap. Then Eric stood up with notes in his hand. He said he wanted to thank the 2 people who made him the doctor standing here tonight. First is my mentor, Dr. Daniel Whitfield, table number 2. Applause erupted. My mother's glass stopped an inch from her lips. Secondly, Eric said, I trained on a fellowship that paid my salary, my research, everything, named after a nurse, Ruth Chase. The founder who funded it didn't let them print her name. It took me 2 years to find out who she was. She built a company from nothing at 23, and she is sitting right next to my mentor because she married him. Grace. Grace Whitfield, would you please stand? Ruth Chase was her grandmother. I stood up, and my mother stood up from her chair too. Her face had turned the color of old snow. My mother said, there's been a misunderstanding. Grace is a distant relative. And Vivian yelled out at that exact moment, you are not invited. Dead silence fell over the entire hall. Eric turned to his bride. Not invited, he said. I invited her, Vivian. This is the woman who paid for my fellowship. This is my mentor's wife. My mother ran to protect her status, Eric. My boy. This is a family matter. Which family? Eric said calmly. 200 guests looked from the bride to her mother and then to me. Susan Holston stood up and looked at my sister. Vivian, she said, you told us you were an only child. Vivian just opened and closed her mouth. My mother tried her final playbook trick. She came to me, grabbed my hand, and said, Grace, darling, we will discuss family matters in private. This is a wedding. 9 years, and I had become darling in less than a minute. I lifted her hands off my arm. I said, Excuse me for a moment, this dress needs some air. I walked toward the terrace doors. My mother followed me. She caught me in the stone corridor. She dropped the act. All right, she said. Here's what happens now. You will come back inside. You will tell the Holston family we have always been close. And then you come back home. Grace, that frame will be filled. You have finally earned your place. All I had to do was tell one lie. I looked at her hands. They were trembling. I gave you a family that keeps score because that was all I ever got, she said. And it worked. Look at Vivian. We both heard it at the same time. Over a ballroom where Vivian's wedding was currently flatlining. I looked down at Ruth's watch. I walked back into that ballroom ahead of my mother. Susan Holston asked me the question. Grace, is it true? Were you a part of this family? I spoke to all 200 of them. I was born a Dixon. When I was 19, I was told that in that family, love is earned, and I stopped earning. I haven't spoken to them in 9 years. Eric, you married someone tonight. I hope you ask her gently for the rest. It's not my story to tell. I chose mercy. I looked at my mother and gave her the answer to her offer. No, I said. That frame will stay empty. I built my own wall. I took Daniel's hand and walked out the front doors of my sister's wedding. We walked out past the frozen fountain to the far end of the terrace in the cold spring night, and my hands started to shake. Daniel draped his jacket over my shoulders. I took out my phone. Grandma Ruth, 41 seconds. I pressed play, and for the first time in 5 years, when her voice reached the 12th second, my thumb didn't move. I need you to hear this, my child, because nobody ever told your mother. Nobody earns love, my child. Love is the one thing they can't bill you for. You were never that empty frame, Gracie. You are the entire wall and the house it holds up. And don't you dare wait for people with ledgers to tell you what your worth is. Come see me on Sunday. Bring nothing. Click. 41 seconds. Then I cried. Only once in this entire story. I opened my drafts folder, found my Christmas card list with my parents' address, and deleted the entry. Then we went home. That dynasty kept crumbling for the next 6 weeks. Vivian had no practice. Her residency had ended halfway through her 2nd year. She had a diploma, but she didn't have the life printed on that wedding card. Eric filed for an annulment 6 weeks later, and he kept Ruth Chase's name on his email signature. My mother resigned from all her positions. My father sent me an email in November. Your grandmother would be proud of you. I never replied. 6 months later, on a normal Sunday, I was sitting at my own dining table. Daniel, my caregivers, my first client's widow, and Eric Holston. On the wall of our dining room, there are 11 frames too. A picture of a fiddle performance, a fishing boat, a coffee tin, 2 wedding photos, and a nurse sitting in her cardigan on a porch swing. Not a single certificate. That watch was on my wrist. That voicemail is still on my phone. If a family has ever forced you to audition for a seat at their table, listen to this. Love that has to be earned was never love. It was a job with no pay. And you are allowed to quit that job. And the table you build after that will hold every person who never fit in your old chairs. This is my story. An empty frame, a nurse's watch, and a voicemail that took me 5 years to finish. If anyone has ever made you feel like you have to earn your place at their table, take this as a sign to build your own table. Share this video with someone who needs that permission today. Leave a comment telling me about your table. Subscribe to Bookbite Studio, and I'll see you in the next video.